This video is to dissect the latter half of John chapter 6, specifically verses 25 to 66, because there seemed to be a lot of confusion about it in the comments section of my last post. I have to start out by saying this is not to bash what people believe. It is just to educate those who may have questions. You are always free to scroll away from my posts. Let's start by recapping what happened in the first half of John chapter 6. It begins with a large crowd following Jesus because they knew he had been performing miracles. Verse 4 says, "Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near." So it was around the time of Passover, but this was in 32 CE, so it was a year before Jesus established the Lord's evening meal. Jesus sees there are many people, so he miraculously feeds them. They're amazed and want to make him king, so he leaves the area. The next day, the people realize Jesus left, so they go out searching for him and finally find him. We'll pick up in verse 25. Jesus calls them out on their motives by saying, "You are looking for me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate from the loaves and were satisfied. Work not for the food that perishes, but for the food that remains for everlasting life." So Jesus could already tell they were way more interested in what he could do for them physically than spiritually. So they said to him, "What must we do to carry out the works of God?" In answer, Jesus said to them, "This is the work of God, that you exercise faith in the one whom he sent." Then they said to him, "What are you performing as a sign so that we may see it and believe you?" Basically, do another miracle to prove that you're the Son of God. They straight up just saw him feed over 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 small fish, and physically heal people. They didn't need any more signs. Right after saying that, they reference Moses feeding the manna in the wilderness, again proving they just care about the material things Jesus could give them. Jesus corrects them in verse 32 and says, "Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." So they said to him, "Lord, always give us this bread." Jesus says to them, "I am the bread of life. But as I said to you, you have even seen me, and yet do not believe." He proceeds to tell them God will bless them with the bread of life, aka everlasting life, if they accept Jesus as who he is, the Son of God who came to redeem mankind with his sacrifice. The Jews began to murmur about him, because he had said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." And they began saying, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, 'I've come down from heaven'?" The next few verses, Jesus basically says Jehovah God gives everyone a choice of whether or not they want to serve him, so he wouldn't force them to accept Jesus. But anyone who did accept Jesus would gain everlasting life. This next part is where people tend to get tripped up. Jesus contrasts the temporary sustenance the Israelites were given by the physical manna in the wilderness with the heavenly manna, or bread of life, which makes it possible for them to live forever. They, quote-unquote, eat of this bread by exercising faith in the redeeming power of Jesus' flesh and blood that he would sacrifice. Jesus is speaking figuratively, using bread as an illustration. He had been using that same illustration the whole time they were talking. But since they were so focused on physical things, they missed the point. Verse 60 says, "When they heard this, many of his disciples said, 'This speech is shocking. Who can listen to it?' But Jesus, knowing in himself that his disciples were murmuring about this, said to them, 'Does this stumble you? What therefore if you should see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that is life-giving. The flesh is of no use at all. The sayings that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. But there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew from the beginning those who did not believe." I think the saddest part of this whole chapter is verse 66. Because of this, many of his disciples went off to the things behind and would no longer walk with him. They just didn't take the time to ask questions. Side point, this is why Jesus used illustrations, because it weeded out those who weren't willing to put forth the effort to understand. If you have questions, please address them. Over 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses around the world offer free Bible studies in over 1,000 languages and in over 240 lands. Why not try one out? You might be pleasantly surprised.